Artan had 9 daughters and a young wife. Guarding the honor of his women was of paramount importance. He kept them well away from any other nomads, roaming for weeks to find a place with pasture and no young men. They navigated endlessly through the remotest deserts. As we sat under the talal tree outside our house in Mogadishu, my grandmother often told us about the beautiful emptiness of sitting in front of a hut she had built with her own hands, staring into the vast, never-ending space. In a sense, my grandmother was living in the Iron Age. There was no system of writing among the nomads. Metal artifacts were rare and precious. The British and Italians claimed to be ruling Somalia, but this would have meant nothing to my grandmother. To her, there were only the clans. The great nomad clans of the Isaq and the Darod, the lesser Hawiya farmers, and lower still, the inferior Sab. The first time she saw a white person, my grandmother was in her 30s. She thought this person's skin had burned off. My mother, Asha, was born sometime in the early 1940s, along with her identical twin sister, Halima. My grandmother gave birth to them alone under a tree. They were her 3rd and 4th children. She was about 18, leading her goats and sheep to pasture when she felt the pains. She lay down and bore forth. Then she cut the umbilical cords with her knife. A few hours later, she gathered together the goats and sheep and managed to bring the herd safely home before dark, carrying her newborn twins. Nobody was impressed by the exploit. She was only bringing home 2 more girls. To my grandmother, feelings were a foolish self-indulgence. Pride was important, though. Pride in your work and your strength and self-reliance. If you were weak, people would speak ill of you. If your thorn fences were not strong enough, your animals would be raided by lions, hyenas and foxes, your husband would marry another, your daughter's virginity would be stolen, and your sons seen as worthless. In her eyes, we were useless children. Bred in a cement block house with a hard roof, we had no skills of value. We walked on roadways. The road in front of our house wasn't paved, but still it was a marked passage in the dirt. We had water from a tap. We could never have found our way home after herding animals through the desert. We couldn't even milk a goat without getting kicked over. My grandmother reserved particular scorn for me. I was terrified of insects, so in her eyes, I was a truly stupid child. By the time her daughters were 5 or 6, my grandmother had already taught them every major skill they would need to survive. I lacked all of them. My mother told us stories too. She had learned to care for her father's animals and herded them through the desert to places that were safe. The goats were easy prey for a predator. So was a young girl. If my mother or her sisters were attacked by men out in the desert, it would be their own fault. They should have fled at the first sight of an unknown camel. If they were ever captured, they were to say 3 times, "Allah be my witness, I want no conflict with you, please leave me alone." To be raped would be far worse than dying, because it would tarnish the honor of everyone in their family. If the invocation to Allah had no effect, my grandmother taught her daughters to run around behind a man, squat down, reach between his legs under his sarong, and yank his testicles hard. They were not to let go. He might hit or kick, but they were to tuck in their heads and take the blows on their backs and hope to hang on long enough to cause the attacker to faint. This move is called Qorgois, and the women of my grandmother's family taught it to their daughters just as they taught them to make thornbush fences to protect the hut from hyenas. I remember one afternoon when Hawa and I were small children, watching my grandmother rubbing sheep fat into a long coil of woven rope before she steeped it in the plant dye that would make it hard and black. "A woman alone is like a piece of sheep fat in the sun," she told us. "Everything will come and feed on that fat. Before you know it, the ants and insects are crawling all over it until there's nothing left but a smear of grease." My grandmother pointed to a goblet of fat melting in the sun just beyond the talal tree's shadow. It was black with ants and gnats. For years, this image inhabited my nightmares. When my mother was a child, she was always dutiful, always obedient. But as she grew up, the world began changing. The old traditions of the nomads were shifting as modern life lured them to villages and cities. So, when she was about 15 years old, my mother walked out of the desert. She left her parents and her older sisters and even her twin sister behind her and began walking. Then she got on a truck and went to the port city of Berbera, and she took a ship across the Red Sea to Arabia. Khadija had preceded her. Khadija was her older stepsister, the child of her father's first wife. Another of my mother's older sisters made the trip too. I don't know what led them to do it. My mother rarely confided her private emotions, but it was the 1950s, and modern life was jabbing its sharp elbow into the farthest parts of the world. My mother was young after all, and I think perhaps she simply didn't want to be left behind in the desert when all the young people had left for the city. My mother went to Aden, where Khadija had already settled, a big city, a center of Britain's colonial rule over the Middle East. She got a job cleaning house for a British woman. She learned about forks and chairs and bathtubs and cleaning brushes. She loved the strict rituals, cleaning, folding, ironing, and the elaborate paraphernalia of settled life. My mother became even more scrupulously attentive about such matters than the woman she worked for. Although she was alone in Aden, without parental supervision, my mother was supremely virtuous. She was determined that nobody would ever have grounds to gossip that she, Asha'atan, had behaved improperly. She never took a taxi or a bus for fear of being seated beside a strange man. She shunned the Somali men who chewed qat and the girls who brewed tea for them and joked around as the buzzy euphoria of the short, fat little leaves got them talking and laughing. Instead, in Aden, my mother learned to pray in the proper Islamic manner. Living in the desert, my grandmother had never really had the time to pray. Among the nomads, women weren't expected to. It was men who spread their prayer mats on the sand 5 times a day and faced Mecca, chanting the Quran. But now, on the Arabian Peninsula, where the Prophet Muhammad received Allah's revelation, my mother learned the ritual ablutions. She learned to cover herself with a plain cloth and pray standing, sitting, prostrating, turning right and left, the ballet of submission to Allah. In the desert, nomad women were not covered. They worked, and it's hard to work under a long veil. While my grandmother herded and cooked, she draped herself in a roughly woven long cloth, the go, leaving her arms, hair, and neck bare. In my grandmother's day, men were commonly present while women breastfed their children. If there was anything arousing about seeing a few inches of female flesh, the men never showed it. My mother had no protector in Aden, no father, no brother. Men leered and bothered her on the street. She began wearing a veil like the Arab women who robed when they left their houses in a long black cloth that left only a slit for their eyes. The veil protected her from those leering men and from the feeling of vileness it gave her to be looked at that way. Her veil was an emblem of her belief. To be beloved of God, you had to be modest. And Asha'atan wanted to be the most proper, most virtuous woman in the city.